Welcome to the Deconstructionist Deep Dive.
The podcast that doesn't just accept the story.
We break it
We examine the pieces.
and expose the machinery inside. Let's dive in. What if the entire argument against pornography isn't just about health, but is a carefully designed system to pathologize your desires and sell you a new form of purity?
So our mission today, it's pretty specific. We're really applying the full analytical framework here.
The Deconstructionist lens.
Exactly. Applying it to this argument against pornography, which is, well, it's incredibly charged emotionally, but also complex in its structure.
And that structure is key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because the source material we're looking at, it's not just, straightforward moral objection. It weaves together spiritual ideas, ethical commands, and this layer of, pseudoscience.
Precisely. It's a hybrid.
Oh.
But our job is to trace that architecture of control. We want to dissect how a deeply felt moral judgment gets repackaged layer by layer using language that sounds scientific, sounds objective, but absolutely isn't. So this deep dive isn't about us telling you whether porn is good or bad for you. That's not the point.
Right.
The point is to expose the machinery, the power dynamics, the logical jumps, the fallacies they use to push towards one specific conclusion.
Right.
Total control over behavior.
Okay. Let's see the system. All right. Let's start unpacking this hybrid architecture, because it really is cleverly built, isn't it? It's like an ideological Trojan horse.
That's a great way to put it.
It seems designed so that no matter your personal leaning, whether you respond more to moral arguments or spiritual ones or things that sound scientific, there's an entry point for you.
Yeah, absolutely. If it were just pure moralizing, like in the old days, they'd only reach a certain crowd, right? The ones already inclined to agree.
Sure.
But to get wider appeal, they built this multi-layered system.
Right.
We've identified basically four main pillars holding up the core argument. It blends that old school shame with the newer language of wellness and self-improvement.
Yeah.
1.1, the moral biological blend.
Okay, so pillar number one, where does it start?
It starts with emotion, the moral foundation. The argument doesn't just suggest potential harm. It asserts that consumption is inherently shameful, that just looking generates guilt.
So shame is the hook.
It's the ignition switch. Once you, the listener, internalize that baseline feeling of guilt, you're suddenly much more open to hearing about a radical solution. You want a way out of feeling bad.
But just feeling guilty isn't always enough, especially now. People are more skeptical.
Right. Guilt alone is fragile, so they need to bolster it. That brings us to the second pillar, pseudoscientific justification. This is where they try to make the shame feel objective, quantitative.
Yeah.
They bring in these, frankly, bizarre concepts like human vibration theory. They actually claim the shame you feel isn't just in your head, it's a measurable low energy frequency, like literally.
Should be so. Put numbers on it.
Oh, yeah. We'll get into the specifics later. But they claim this low vibration messes with your personal energy field, impacting your success, your finances, everything. It wraps the moral judgment in a cloak that looks vaguely like physics.
Wow. Okay, so you've got shame backed up by fake physics. Where does the biology come in?
That's pillar 3, the biological mechanism. This is where they borrow and heavily distort ideas from actual neuroscience. They talk about dopamine conditioning, negative feedback loops.
Making it sound like your brain is being physically hijacked.
Exactly. The message is terrifyingly simple. Your brain chemistry is being rewired against your will. You're losing control at a fundamental biological level.
Okay, so moral shame, pseudoscientific proof, and a biological hijacking. What's the final piece?
They need the knockout punch. The worst case scenario to justify the extreme solution they're selling, that's pillar 4. The social consequence.
The slippery slope.
Classic slippery slope. They argue that this consumption inevitably leads to specific sexual problems, the big one being PIE, pornography-induced erectile dysfunction. But it doesn't stop there.
Oh.
No, it broadens out into this vague but terrifying idea of generalized life failure. You'll fail at work, fail in relationships, fail to achieve authentic masculinity, whatever that means in their book.
So the whole structure feeds back on itself. Shame leads to fear. The science justifies the shame, the biology explains the mechanism, and the social consequences provide the ultimate threat.
Precisely. It's a closed loop designed to lead you to one place.
Before we even start debunking the specific claims about dopamine or vibrations, we need to dig deeper. What are the core assumptions this whole thing is built on? The ideas they just state as fact without proof.
Right, the unproven axioms. These are crucial because if these foundational ideas are shaky, the entire argument collapses. We found 3 key ones.
What's the first?
The most critical one is what we're calling addiction determinism. It's a subtle but powerful move.
How does it work?
The rhetoric simply assumes that any level of engagement, even just curious exploration or occasional use, or what most people would consider moderation, inevitably leads to full-blown addiction.
So there's no spectrum. It's just zero or addict.
Exactly. No middle ground allowed. You don't get a choice. The model says you will become addicted from the moment you start. It's presented as a deterministic outcome.
Hang on. If everyone is automatically defined as an inevitable addict, what does that do to the idea of personal agency or responsibility?
It obliterates it. And that's the point. If addiction is inevitable, then the individual isn't really responsible, are they? They're a victim, which means...
They need saving by the person selling the cure.
Bingo. And it leads directly to the second axiom, the moderation fallacy. If addiction is guaranteed, then moderation must be impossible by definition.
So they shut down any conversation about finding a balance or setting limits.
Completely. The rhetoric actively dismisses any possibility of self-management, healthy boundaries, or responsible use. Because if those things were possible, you wouldn't need their extreme all-or-nothing solution. You wouldn't need the guru.
It forces everything into this very simple, very stark binary choice.
Which brings us to their conclusion.
Yes, the absolute conclusion. The entire argument, starting from these unproven axioms, the vibration theory we mentioned, this addiction determinism model, it just leaps over all the complex steps you'd need for a real argument. It skips the need for actual evidence, ignores psychological nuance.
It lands where?
It lands directly on the only answer they permit: total prohibition. It frames the choice starkly. It's either complete abstinence, following their rules, or it's slavery to your base desires.
And freedom, in their dictionary, just means conforming perfectly to their specific moral code.
That's the twist. Freedom becomes obedience.
Okay, so the structure is designed to eliminate nuance, force a binary. Now, we need to really pull back that scientific veil they hide behind, because the argument sounds so authoritative, especially about brain chemistry.
Right. This is where they gain a lot of traction. The scientific veneer makes the moral judgment seem objective, almost medical. 2.1 misrepresentation of dopamine chemistry, the false dopamine hypothesis.
Yeah, the dopamine argument is, well, it's a masterclass in exploiting a little bit of public knowledge about neuroscience. The core idea they push is what we're calling the false dopamine hypothesis.
It sounds compelling, though, right? This idea taps into that whole authenticity obsession in self-help. They claim you get false dopamine hits from porn, cheap, easy, damaging hits.
Right, versus the authentic dopamine you supposedly get from good things like hard work, exercise, or, sex within their approved context like marriage.
So they're essentially assigning moral values to a neurotransmitter, saying some dopamine is good and some is bad.
Exactly. And that's the fundamental scientific flaw. It's a profound misunderstanding, or maybe misrepresentation, of what dopamine actually does.
Okay, so what does it do? If it's not just a reward chemical, it's primarily a motivation chemical. Its main job isn't just to signal reward after the fact. It's to generate desire, anticipation, the drive to seek something out. It flags a stimulus, any stimulus really, pleasurable or even stressful, as potentially important, motivating you to engage with it.
So the dopamine released when I anticipate eating cake versus the dopamine when I anticipate finishing a project, biochemically it's the same stuff.
Fundamentally, yes. The chemical itself, the pathways it uses in the brain, like in the nucleus accumbens, it's the same mechanism driving seeking behavior across the board. The brain doesn't have separate good and bad dopamine receptors.
So there's no actual neurological basis for labeling one dopamine hit false and another true.
None whatsoever. No specific receptor subtype, no known pathway that differentiates based on the source of the stimulus in that moral way. The brain responds strongly to novelty and anticipation, regardless of whether the source is deemed morally good or bad by external standards.
That moral labeling,
Yeah.
that's added later by the person making the argument.
Precisely. The judgment comes from the guru, not the neural network. By twisting the science, they convince you that your own brain's natural response to stimuli, especially novel ones, is somehow broken or corrupt. 2.2, the pseudoscience of vibrational morality.
Okay, if the dopamine argument misrepresents neuroscience, the next part seems to leave science behind entirely, this vibrational morality.
Oh, absolutely. This is where they try to quantify subjective states, to give objective measurements to things like shame or enlightenment. It's pure pseudophysics.
Why do they need this if they already have the dopamine angle?
Because the dopamine argument, even misrepresented, doesn't quite prove immorality in a tangible way. They can't point to a brain scan and say, see, evil. So they invent a different kind of physical proof based on energy, frequency, vibration. It's an attempt to medicalize morality using physics jargon.
And the sources we looked at get really specific with numbers, don't they?
Incredibly specific. It's almost comical. They literally assign numerical frequencies to emotional and spiritual states.
Like what?
Like, the state of shame is said to vibrate at a frequency of 5. Just 5. Then acceptance jumps way up to 400. And enlightenment, the ultimate goal, is supposedly 1200 or even higher.
5 what? 400 what? Megahertz? Compared to what baseline?
Exactly. That's the critical question they never answer because they can't. There's no unit, no scale, no empirical basis for these numbers whatsoever.
So it just sounds vaguely scientific because it uses terms like frequency and vibration.
Precisely. It's what we call scientific bafflement. Look, the human body does have electrical signals. Brainwaves measured in hertz via EEG, heart rhythms, nerve impulses. These are measurable internal biological processes.
But that's totally different from claiming shame itself is a frequency of 5 that radiates outwards and affects reality.
Completely different. The claim that an emotional state like shame corresponds to a specific, quantifiable, universal energy frequency 5, 400, 1200 that influences the external world. There's absolutely zero scientific evidence for that. None.
It just made up numbers assigned to feelings.
It's textbook pseudoscience. Using impressive standing but meaningless numbers to give a veneer of objectivity to a pre-decided moral hierarchy. It's designed to make critics feel unqualified, like they just don't understand higher consciousness or quantum physics. 2.3, exaggerating the PIE epidemic.
Okay, so the dopamine is misrepresented, the vibration is pure invention. What about the third scientific pillar, the one that seems to hit hardest? The PIE threat, pornography-induced erectile dysfunction.
Right. This is probably the most potent weapon in their arsenal because it taps into such a deep-seated fear, particularly for men. The rhetoric constantly frames PIED as this looming widespread epidemic.
Yeah, you hear that word epidemic thrown around a lot. It creates this sense of urgency that something drastic must be done now.
Exactly. It fuels the need for their radical intervention. But the entire argument hinges on a fundamental logical error, one that's glaringly obvious if you look critically.
Which is?
Correlation is presented as causation,
Yeah.
a classic fallacy.
How does that play out here?
Well, think about who might be researching or worrying about erectile dysfunction. It's often people already experiencing issues, right? Perhaps due to stress, anxiety, health problems, relationship difficulties.
Sure.
And yes, many of those same people probably also consume pornography because it's incredibly common. So you have a correlation. People with ED symptoms often also use porn.
But the argument jumps from that correlation.
Straight to causation. It declares that the porn is the cause, the single definitive reason for the dysfunction.
Ignoring all the other possible factors.
Completely ignoring them. Strategically so. It allows them to sidestep the huge, complex web of actual contributing factors. Chronic stress, anxiety disorders, depression, relationship conflict, general health issues like diabetes or cardiovascular problems, poor sleep, medication side effects, the list goes on and on.
All massive contributors to sexual health.
Huge. But acknowledging that complexity doesn't serve their narrative, it's much easier, much more convenient for their moral agenda to point to a single, easily demonized villain pornography and blame everything on that.
So it simplifies a complex health issue into a moral failing, solvable only by abstinence.
Exactly. It's not careful medical analysis. It's fear-mongering dressed up as health advice.
Okay, so if the science they use is shaky at best, fraudulent at worst, how does this argument gain so much traction? Why is it so persuasive for so many people? We need to look past the claims themselves and analyze the techniques they use.
Right. It's not just what they say, but how they say it. There's a definite toolkit here, what you call the art of bafflement, 3.1, the persuasion toolkit, the art of bafflement. The rhetoric works because it targets core psychological vulnerabilities very effectively. First and foremost, fear appeals.
We saw that with the PIED claims.
Absolutely. They zero in on anxieties about masculine identity, linking porn use directly to erectile dysfunction, and then linking that to overall life failure as a partner, a provider that hits a primal nerve for many men.
And then there's the scientific bafflement we already touched on.
Yes, the deliberate misuse of technical jargon, vibration, frequency, dopamine loops, neuroplasticity. Throwing these terms around makes the argument sound sophisticated, authoritative.
Even if the usage is completely wrong.
Especially then. The goal isn't really to educate the listener on the science, it's often to intimidate them, to make them feel like if they question it, they just don't understand complex physics or neuroscience. It shuts down critique.
And we talked about the false binaries. That seems critical to trapping the audience.
Crucial. Constantly framing the choice as abstinence versus slavery, freedom versus addiction, enlightenment versus shame. It leaves no room for nuance, no possibility for a middle path.
It forces you to pick a side, and they've already defined one side as catastrophic.
Exactly. It preemptively dismisses any discussion of moderation, responsible use, or context. If you're not 100% with them, you're defined as part of the problem, as enslaved.
And finally, what holds it all together? What gives it that air of certainty?
Authority claims, primarily through personal testimony. The guru's own story, I was lost, I was addicted, I hit rock bottom, but this specific system saved me, is presented as definitive proof.
So, anecdote trumps data.
Completely. The personal success story, often highly embellished or curated, becomes the evidence. It overrides any need for systematic, objective, verifiable data that you'd expect for any serious claim, especially a medical or psychological one. If the leader says it worked for them, it's positioned as universally true and applicable. 3.2 historical echoes. Medicalizing morality. Now, it's really important to zoom out here, because this tactic, taking a moral panic and dressing it up in scientific or medical language, it's not new, not at all.
You mean we've seen this pattern before?
Oh, absolutely. Medicalizing moral disapproval is a recurring theme throughout history. It's a way to give social control the weight of objective necessity.
Oh, but what? What are the parallels?
Well, the most striking one, related to the PIED panic, is the Victorian parallel, the hysteria around masturbation in the 19th century.
Right, the idea that it caused insanity.
Insanity, epilepsy, blindness, consumption, general weakness, you name it. Victorian doctors, often driven by moral anxieties about non-procreative sexuality and wasted vital fluids, invented a whole raft of supposed medical consequences.
Just like the PIED epidemic today.
The structure is identical. You take a private, often pleasurable act that challenges certain social norms, and you pathologize it. You invent terrifying physical consequences to enforce conformity. The specific disease changes from madness to erectile dysfunction, but the underlying mechanism of using medical fear to control behavior around sex and pleasure is exactly the same.
And what about the pseudoscience aspect, the vibration theory? Does that have historical echoes?
Definitely. It fits right in with other historical attempts to create scientific justifications for prejudice or pre-existing beliefs. Think about phrenology in the 19th century.
Measuring bumps on the head to determine character.
Exactly. Phrenologists use these elaborate but ultimately meaningless measurements and charts to prove the superiority or inferiority of certain races or classes. It was pseudoscience used to legitimize social biases.
Just like vibration theory uses made-up numbers like 5 or 400 to legitimize a moral hierarchy about shame and enlightenment.
Precisely. Both take a pre-existing cultural judgment and try to backfill it with sciencey-sounding quantitative data to make it seem objective and undeniable.
And that all-or-nothing thinking, the moderation fallacy.
That has strong echoes, too, particularly in Prohibition-era absolutism. The temperance movement that led to alcohol prohibition in the U.S. often relied on this idea of one-drink determinism.
Meaning any amount of alcohol inevitably leads to ruin.
Yes. They argued moderation was impossible, that alcohol was inherently corrupting, so the only solution was total elimination. It's the same absolutist logic. If something can be problematic in excess for some people, then it must be declared universally dangerous and forbidden for everyone.
So seeing these historical parallels helps us recognize the current anti-porn argument not as some new scientific discovery, but as a familiar pattern.
Exactly. It's a very old playbook, just updated with modern jargon like dopamine and frequency instead of vital fluids and skull bumps.
Okay, so the science is weak, the logic relies on fallacies, and the tactics are historically familiar. This suggests the argument isn't really held up by its own internal consistency. It must be serving other purposes. We need to look at the contradictions and who actually benefits.
Right. If an argument is full of holes but still persists and spreads, you have to ask, what internal contradictions keep adherents locked in, and whose interests does it serve externally? 4.1. The paradox of freedom and agency. The most glaring internal contradiction revolves around their use of the word freedom. The entire narrative is framed as a quest for liberation.
Freedom from desire, freedom from addiction, freedom from the system. It sounds empowering.
It sounds empowering, but then you look at what they actually demand. This is the freedom definition contradiction. The freedom they offer requires absolute, rigid conformity to their very specific, culturally narrow definition of correct sexual behavior and morality.
So freedom means obedience.
Essentially, yes. They take traditional, culturally specific norms about sex and relationships, present them as objective universal truths, often backed by that faulty science, and then define adherence to these norms as the only path to true freedom. It's control rebranded as liberation.
And this ties into how they view the audience's own capability, right? That there seems to be a paradox there, too.
A huge one. We call it the agency paradox. The rhetoric does two completely contradictory things simultaneously. On the one hand, it tells the audience they are fundamentally weak, neurologically hijacked, completely vulnerable to manipulation by stimuli.
Meaning they have no agency, they're victims who need help, which justifies buying the guru's program or following their strict rules.
Exactly. It establishes the need for external intervention. But in the very next breath, they demand that this same supposedly helpless individual must suddenly summon superhuman willpower.
To achieve perfect, lifelong abstinence. No slips, no errors.
Right. An incredibly difficult feat of self-denial and constant vigilance. So you're simultaneously presented as neurochemically broken and incapable of resisting temptation, and as someone who must achieve perfect ascetic self-control immediately.
You're both things at once, depending on what the argument needs you to be at that moment.
Precisely. You're vulnerable enough to need the guru, but capable enough to be blamed if you fail to achieve the perfection they demand. It's a perfect trap. 4.2 ideological affiliations and the purist mindset. This kind of thinking doesn't come from nowhere. It's actually a clever blend of different, sometimes conflicting ideological streams. That's part of why it appeals to a surprisingly diverse audience.
What streams are we seeing merged here?
Well, there's definitely some New Age borrowing. The whole vibrational frequency thing, shame at 5, enlightenment at 1200, that comes directly from New Age spirituality, law of attraction type concepts. It appeals to people looking for a kind of spiritual physics.
But it doesn't feel purely New Age. It feels much more traditional in other ways.
Exactly. That New Age gloss is layered onto a very solid foundation of traditional alignment. The intense focus on male sexual performance, PIED, the links made between sexual control and career success, the emphasis on traditional gender roles and provider anxieties that resonates deeply with conservative or traditionalist viewpoints about masculinity.
So it bridges those two worlds.
It attempts to. And underpinning it all is a more fundamental philosophical stance, puritanical asceticism.
Meaning a basic distrust of pleasure.
A deep systemic suspicion of pleasure for its own sake, especially bodily pleasure, and especially self-directed pleasure. Any pleasure that isn't channeled towards productive or socially sanctioned ends, like procreation within marriage or reward after hard work, is seen as inherently dangerous, corrupting, leading inevitably to decay.
And so self-denial becomes the highest virtue.
Yes. Rigorous, often joyless self-denial is elevated as the ultimate sign of strength, discipline, and worthiness, which, conveniently for their marketing, gets rebranded as freedom and power. 4.3 exposing the benefiting hierarchies, the control mechanisms.
Okay, if the argument itself is contradictory and draws on these specific ideologies, the final question is always, cui bono? Who benefits when people buy into this?
Right. When an audience internalizes this level of shame and believes only total abstinence is viable, who gains power or profit?
The most obvious beneficiary seems to be the influencer economy itself.
Absolutely. This entire framework is perfectly designed to create dependency. If you convince people they are fundamentally broken, addicted, vibrating at shame level 5, neurochemically hijacked, then you position yourself as the sole possessor of the cure, the path to enlightenment, the secret to fixing their broken brain.
So the guru becomes indispensable.
Indispensable and profitable. It creates a continuous need for their guidance, their courses, their books, their coaching, their retreats. Shame and fear are incredibly effective drivers of consumer behavior in the self-help market.
Beyond the individual influencer, does it serve broader structures?
Yes, I think it clearly functions to reinforce existing patriarchal structures. By defining healthy sexuality so narrowly, aligning it only with traditional marital norms and performance expectations, it implicitly condemns deviation. It reinforces rigid gender roles and boundaries that benefit systems where power is tied to those traditional structures.
And what about on an even bigger scale? Does it connect to economic or political systems?
I think it functions brilliantly as a control mechanism supporting capitalist individualism. Think about it. The entire focus is on individual failure and individual consumption choices.
All the problems, anxiety, unhappiness, lack of success are blamed on your personal habits, specifically watching porn.
Exactly. It forces the blame inwards. You internalize the shame, you focus on purifying your individual behavior, and what does that distract you from?
From looking at potentially systemic issues like economic insecurity, lack of opportunity, toxic work cultures, relationship dynamics, political anxieties.
Precisely. If all your problems can be solved by simply stopping one specific personal behavior, you don't need to question the broader systems you live in. It keeps the focus on individual self-policing, which is incredibly convenient for maintaining the status quo. It's a perfect loop of individual responsibility for potentially systemic dissatisfaction.
Okay, we've pulled the whole thing apart. We've seen the faulty science, the logical fallacies, the historical precedents, the contradictions, the power interests. Deconstruction complete. Now, the crucial step, if that purest binary of abstinence versus slavery is flawed and destructive, what are the better ways to think about this? What are the alternatives?
Right. We can't just tear down without offering more robust frameworks. And thankfully, philosophy and psychology offer much healthier ways to approach desire and behavior than absolutist prohibition. 5.1 classical and existential counterpoints. We can look way back, for instance, to Aristotelian ethics. Aristotle had a very different concept of virtue.
Not as an extreme, right?
Yeah, not at all. For Aristotle, virtue wasn't about eliminating things. It was about finding the balance, the famous golden mean. It's the midpoint between two extremes, the vices of excess on one side and deficiency on the other.
So, applied here, virtue wouldn't be total abstinence necessarily, but finding a skillful relationship with desire.
Exactly. It directly challenges the binary thinking. The goal isn't the impossible task of eliminating desire, which is a fundamental part of being human, but developing the wisdom and skill to manage it. How do you engage with these powerful drives in a way that actually contributes to a flourishing life, rather than requiring constant, miserable self-suppression?
That sounds much more realistic. What about more modern philosophy?
Existentialism offers a really powerful lens here too, particularly around freedom and agency. It gives us a much richer understanding of what it means to be free.
How so? The purest argument claims their way is freedom.
But it's a very thin definition of freedom, basically. Freedom from temptation through elimination. Existentialism defines freedom much more actively. Freedom isn't achieved by getting rid of desires or impulses. Freedom lies in your conscious engagement with them. It's about choosing how you respond.
So agency isn't about never feeling an urge, but about deciding what to do when you feel it.
Precisely. The highest form of agency isn't being impulse-free. It's owning your choices in the face of your impulses. That's a much stronger, more authentic kind of freedom than simply trying to erase parts of your own nature. 5.2, the harm reduction approach, the spectrum model.
Okay, those philosophical ideas are great anchors. How do they translate into practical approaches we can use today?
They lead very naturally to models like the harm reduction approach, which is widely used in public health and addiction treatment, precisely because it's pragmatic and non-judgmental.
How does that differ from the abstinence-only model?
Fundamentally, it rejects the binary. Instead of forcing behavior into good or bad, addicted or clean, it views behavior, all behavior, on a spectrum. It acknowledges nuance, context, and the possibility of degrees.
So it doesn't assume everyone who engages in a behavior is automatically addicted or enslaved?
Not at all. It emphasizes contextual evaluation. It understands that the impact of any behavior, whether it's substance use, eating habits, or media consumption, depends entirely on the individual's specific circumstances.
Meaning the same behavior could be genuinely harmful for one person, but manageable or even benign for another.
Exactly. Is the behavior interfering with their relationships, their work, their health, their own stated goals? Is it a coping mechanism for deeper issues? Or is it just recreation? The focus isn't on the behavior itself in isolation, but on its function and consequences within the context of that individual's life.
So the goal isn't necessarily elimination, but
What?
minimizing harm, increasing conscious choice.
Both. The focus shifts squarely onto agency emphasis. Instead of demanding impossible perfection and shaming inevitable failures, harm reduction aims to empower the individual by helping them understand their own patterns, their triggers, their motivations, by giving them tools and strategies to manage complexity, reduce potential harms if they exist, and make choices that are actually aligned with their own values and well-being. It's about building capacity for conscious choice, not demanding robotic compliance. 5.3 Critical Thinking Markers, the takeaway template.
All right, this has been a deep dive. We've deconstructed the argument, explored alternatives. What are the key takeaways? How can our listeners spot this kind of manipulative rhetoric in the future, maybe about totally different topics?
Yeah, let's synthesize this into a practical toolkit. A template for critical thinking you can apply anywhere: nutrition, finance, productivity, relationships. Anywhere someone is selling you a simple solution to a complex problem.
Okay, red flag number 1.
Listen for the red flag terms. Words borrowed from science but used loosely or without proper context. Frequency, vibration, quantum, energy field, or medical terms like epidemic, used without any actual epidemiological data to back it up.
If it sounds sciencey, but they can't show you the verifiable data or define their terms rigorously, be suspicious.
Deeply suspicious. Second, look closely at the argumentative tactics. Are they forcing you into a false dichotomy? Only two options. One, obviously terrible.
Binary trap.
Right. Are they using slippery slip reasoning? If you do this one small thing, your life will inevitably spiral into disaster. Is the primary evidence anecdotal, just the guru's personal story overriding any need for systematic public evidence?
Basically, if the way they argue feels manipulative or logically weak, pay attention.
Exactly. And the biggest red flag, the ultimate warning sign, is the rhetorical move itself, using manufactured moral urgency to bypass critical thinking.
How does that work?
If the argument constantly insists that the sky is falling, that you must act now, that this is an existential crisis, that sense of panic is often deliberately created. It's designed to short-circuit your rational brain, to stop you from carefully examining the evidence, the logic, the contradictions, the speaker's own motives.
So when you feel that pressure, that urgency, that's precisely the moment to pause, take a breath, and engage your critical faculties.
That's the moment to ask the hard questions. Why the rush? Where's the proof? Who benefits from me believing this? And that's our deep dive for this week.
Remember, the most dangerous illusion is the one you don't know you're in.
But now you know. So here's our question for you. So we've torn apart the vibrational morality argument. Now the real question is, what is the one idea you've held on to about success, relationships, or your own potential that you're finally ready to put on the shopping block and deconstruct for yourself?
Let us know in the comments. Question the narrative. Deconstruct the dogma. See the system.
We'll see you next time. Stay skeptical.